Okay, no worries. I'm alive.
We're on air! So in my case, a good morning to you. In your case, I'm guessing a good evening to you. In Australia, welcome, Lee Rowlands, Kim. Hey, is it? Yes, it's Pepper. Lee it's so confusing, right? Lee Rowlands with his S on his name. His username is La Rowland without. And then all of a sudden I had this total moment of doubt when I didn't know whether it was Kim Peppers or Kim Pepper because Lee distracted me so much with that. Right.
Or I just call him Lara Land. Lara Land.
So Lara Land. Anyway, welcome to the this is the Acquia podcast, and this is a thing we're calling Jam's Virtual Drupal Camp, and it's a chance for me to get to see sessions that I found very interesting, either for a second time or if I missed them somewhere, and it's also a chance for us to spread good and useful information to our community and to help all of you understand Drupal better, learn Drupal, and be better Drupalists. Today I have two friends and colleagues with me from PreviousNext in Australia, Lee Rowlands and Kim Pepper. And actually, if you guys have proper official titles, why don't you fill us in on what those are and what you do in your day jobs?
Okay. Should I go first?
Go for it.
So I'm the co-founder and technical director of PreviousNext. So I started PreviousNext about 5 years ago, and been working with Drupal ever since.
I got distracted because Pam joined the call. Did you guys tell her to come on the call? Pam,
get on.
Pam, go to the event page.
Oh, it's like I didn't share this with my son. He might have accidentally joined too. I was thinking of
Right. Okay, so, sorry. Now, I was distracted. Tell me, Kim, what's your first Drupal memory?
I think my first Drupal memory was basically pitching for a project. I won't mention the client, but we won the project when I didn't really know Drupal at all, and it was basically looking through some source code and just seeing a whole bunch of specially named hooks and function names and just going, what the F is this all about? I had no idea what I was getting myself.
Arrays everywhere.
It was arrays. Mountains of arrays. And I just had to learn through a trial by fire, basically. I didn't really know much about the community then, so I didn't think to kind of reach out and find people and ask questions in IRC or forums. I sort of just tried to battle through, basically, and it was a bit of a tough ride.
That's a common experience I hear from people where they download this Drupal thing or they get thrown into the middle of it, and for one, interestingly, some people don't realize that it's designed to be extensible, so it doesn't do super much when you just turn it on the first time, right? And if you come from a really heavy developer background, there's a real temptation, of course, to just start hacking on it immediately. And the other interesting one, given how great a community we have and how helpful a community we have and how much information there is out there, some people don't realize that you can go and ask and that you can go get help, and that there are usually local meetups, and there's, of course, IRC and everything else. So it's interesting. People's paths of discovery into the project can be so interesting. So, and what version of Drupal was that when you opened
it was 6. I think 6. It was pretty new, and I thought I'll use the latest version, not realizing there was a whole bunch of modules that that you would need that weren't written yet, and so it was kind of like I said, it was a bit of a trial by fire, and I probably, hacked modules and did what I did to try and get stuff to work. And I made all the mistakes that people normally make, taking the approach of, right, this is just an application, I'll just start, writing code rather than using APIs and things like that. And it was also, it's a huge cultural change, going into working in a, before that I was actually doing lots of Java development in a like a startup, and there wasn't this culture of sharing your code. It was a totally different culture. You wrote everything yourself. You might have shared some Java libraries and things like that, but a completely different culture to what Drupal is.
So, business tip: open source is much more efficient and a money saver because we're always building on the work of our other colleagues, and there's an intense world of best practices and millions of hours of coding already done for you when you get started.
Yeah.
Hey, so Lee, we talked about this a few months ago, but tell me when you got into Drupal and what version of Drupal that was.
Yeah, so I think I've told the story before, but I had to build one of those things that you see in the foyer of a cinema that shows the trailers and rotates through all the trailers. And so this was working for this was owned by the local council, this cinema, and I was said, yeah, do it with Drupal. This was 4.7, and yeah, my first memory was node/1, and I went looking for this folder called node, and I couldn't find it.
Yes,
and
now I remember.
Up to then, everything I'd done was, separate PHP file for everything, and so I put it to one side, and I didn't come back until 5 was out, and we had CCK, and looked at it again, and then it kind of made a lot more sense.
Right. Yes, I remember you talking about looking through the directory tree for the directory called node and the file called one. So yeah, also good times. But so you've been around long enough. Talk about. So I find it an interesting contrast with the things that we moved into core in Drupal 7, and now even more in Drupal 8, where lots of us are saying, hey, Drupal 8, you're going to be able to build useful sites right from day one. There's enough functionality to cover a lot of use cases already. Views in core being a great example of that. Compare and contrast that to the Drupal 6 initial phase that Kim referred to, where we had the newest version of Drupal out, but Views wasn't ported to it yet, CCK wasn't ported to it yet, and there was the big triumvirate. Every Drupal 5 site had Views, CCK, and panels, right? And none of the three were out for Drupal 6, and there was this moment of paralysis, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wasn't a panels user. I used to use it. I tried it, and I realized you could make these UI, layouts through the UI, and I didn't like the markup they produced. And it wasn't until I worked with Boris Gordon that I realized that you could actually create your own templates for them. So up until then, I was doing everything the old school way, pre-panels, using the Drupal core theme system. Yeah, but for me, Drupal 5 to Drupal 6, I mean, the first sites that I built where Drupal 6 was just starting to come out, and yeah, I mean, I went with stuff for 5 because things weren't available. And look, you're right, exactly right about Drupal 8. I mean, as a proof of concept, after seeing the Snowman talk by Roy and Jeff from a recent DrupalCon, I went off and tried to make like a Drupal 8 site, and so I took a hypothetical situation of a musician and tried to build a full site for a musician with, like, a bio and events page, and you could build it. We had a date field, we had entity reference to link the tracks to the albums. Everything that was needed was there. It was a great process. I found a lot of simple bugs, and we were able to fix them, and it sort of came up with a default content solution as well, because I was burning this site and rebuilding it. And yeah, it really is going to be a much there's obviously going to be some modules that you rely on, that you go to modules, but in terms of being able to build some fully functioning sites, you'll be able to do a lot of it when 8 first comes out. That's
yet another thing that I'm incredibly excited about in this release cycle. So Kim, what is your favorite thing about Drupal?
Look, I think one thing that I noticed that there's lots of comparisons with other frameworks. So people might often compare Drupal against Node.js or Ruby on Rails, and they talk about the ease of development with those frameworks. But what the point they miss, I think, is that Drupal's actually operating at a much kind of higher level of abstraction than that. It's dealing with much bigger building blocks, and I think that's really Drupal's core power. It's still enough of a framework that you can easily write your own modules and code and have that integrated in a nice, clean way. But really, you're dealing with the kind of bigger building blocks for building a site. You don't have to go and build your own authentication system, or you don't have to build your own kind of content publishing workflow. All of those kind of big building blocks are pretty much there, or from core and contributed modules. So it's incredibly powerful. So sure, you could build a Symfony app that operates as a web service, but when you've got a tool like you will have in Drupal 8 for building web services, it's just going to be a lot simpler. There's a lot less code to write. You might not have to write any code at all, but if you do, there's going to be a whole lot less code that you actually have to write to get done what you need.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about that thing that you just touched on, especially because Drupal 8 is relatively agnostic as far as the output goes. I mean, it's set up to produce HTML5, but it's built so that you can output serialized JSON or anything else you can think of. And we do have this fully RESTful web services style architecture now. So actually, you've got a tool in Drupal 8. It is a UI for building APIs and web services, right? You can build API, you can model, the data architecture without knowing too much code, right? You can build API-based businesses. You can, be a services engine behind the scenes for all sorts of new and interesting things. It's not just for making websites anymore, right? You could make the next go.
Yeah, I think that's a big shift from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. So Drupal 7 was still focused on publishing web pages. It was a content publishing model. The way that all of the internal systems are decoupled now using dependency injection and the Symfony dependency injection container, the fact that we're using plugins everywhere, essentially all of those parts are very nicely decoupled now. So you can build more specific web applications in Drupal 8. You're not really tied to the kind of content publishing workflows that you were in Drupal 7.
And I'm also, so Drupal 8 has been, one of the goals was to build it as part of the multi-device reality. So, responsive web design was the most obvious piece of that going forward. So it can work on a phone and it can work on a tablet, but we're rapidly progressing from this multi-screen reality to a multi-device reality, the Internet of Things, and actually with this architecture, we're really, really, really well placed to do innovative things with whatever it is that the Internet is turning into now, right? So it's not just content publishing web flows, it's like absorbing the data from my watch, and I don't even know, right?
And it's even
happening certainly a lot more.
Sorry, Lee, you go.
Yeah, it was certainly a lot more agile in that regard. I mean, having built gone through like Symfony, like web services, building REST server with Symfony, and done it with Ruby on Rails, and and having done it with Drupal 8, it's just a lot easier to get rapid prototyping done, and you could get a proof of concept for that up in half a day, and it could be quite a complex data model, and it's very powerful.
Is that your next session for me?
No. I have one more thing to add, which is basically like the way that people are still building websites is changing. So you would have seen there's this kind of proliferation of these kind of JavaScript frameworks or MVC framework for building websites now, like single-page apps, those kinds of things. So that's definitely been a huge swing in the last couple of years, which Drupal 8 is actually in a really good place to support that. So Drupal can still be the content structuring tool, the way to kind of have all of your content modeled and have a nice user interface for managing all of that content. But it can be completely decoupled from the front end display of all that, and that can be all done in JavaScript and however you want that to be done. And there's no kind of restriction now in how that could actually be done with Drupal 8. We're not tied to kind of having to publish kind of HTML straight out of Drupal.
Right, Larry Garfield put it best, I think. He said, Drupal is the very best tool out there for managing content. It's not the perfect tool if you want to build pages and hierarchies of stuff, but it's the best thing we've got for managing content, and so yeah, of course that fits into this stuff that you're talking about now perfectly.
And it's a good plug for a session in Austin by Rob Caracas. So he's doing a Drupal without the theme layer, essentially. Oh,
cool! I'm going to look for that, and yes, I will make sure you tweet about that at me, and then I'll notice. So,
sure.
Last couple of questions before we go into your session today. Lee, talk about being an open source software developer.
That's a curly one. Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to explain to people that you meet. What do you do? I write software and I give it away. And it's very hard for them to grapple with that concept. But it is a self-sustaining model. I mean, I've been doing it now for, probably 6 or more years. And like I recently was asked to do like one of those showcase things on Drupal.org. And, looking back, my exposure and my clientele and like just exploded once I started contributing the code back. So I'm in a regional area of Queensland, which is one of Australia's states, and I'm sort of 5 hours from the nearest capital city. It's a smallish city, and there's a limited client base that I could have had here when I first started. And when I started contributing my code back to Drupal.org, all of a sudden I had business opportunities coming in from around the world, and if I hadn't have made that first step to be an open source contributor, I certainly wouldn't be where I am today. It's meant so many opportunities to me.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So either of you, feel free to jump in on this one. Working in open source, what's the most unexpected thing that you've learned or seen along the way?
I could probably jump in and answer that. I think from a business owner's perspective, I think I'm surprised at just how much value you get out of allowing your developers time to spend on working on open source software. That's not just sort of implementing a site with open source software, but actually contributing back to either core or contributed modules. It's hugely rewarding for developers in terms of raising their profile and getting their exposure. Plus, for a business owner, it's a form of training, right? So you're actually, by allowing that time, they're getting much more knowledgeable. They're becoming experts in their domain. And so what time you...
Right.
And we lost Kim.
Apparently, and he was in the middle of an amazing soundbite. I hope we can.
We'll have to get that up. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I can sort of continue on. I mean, my background is in engineering and mathematics, and I didn't actually do. I mean, I did computing as elective and as a hobby, and I've got a lot of my computing formal training, for want of a word, through the Drupal issue queue. You know, you learn from others, and I think we've got Kim back.
Hey Kim, so you were on your way to being my soundbite of the month. Why don't you finish that thought? So as a business owner, letting your employees work on.
Yeah. Sorry about the Wi-Fi's a bit dropping out here. Yeah. So as a business owner, essentially allowing time to work on Drupal core or contrib, essentially allowing them to work part of their time on open source software. While it's not directly billable work, there is a huge benefit in that. So all the developers are essentially gaining expertise in the technology. They're raising their own personal profile, so they're getting exposure, they're getting recognition, which then reflects back on the business as well.
I'm glad he got that last bit out.
I dropped out again.
Yeah, but you finished the full sentence, so it was cool. Hey, I did think of one more question. There was a really great headline. Was it this week, where it looks like the Australian government is going to center on Drupal as their default go-to CMS solution. What's going on down there?
Yes, I mean that's huge news for us. I mean,
Lee, you're not in the same room with him, are you?
No, I'm not even in the same state.
So Queensland has a better pipe than, where's Kim anyway?
Departments.
Right. No. Yes.
No.
Kim.
Oh.
Are you getting a Cat 5 cable?
Yeah, I
am. It is huge news, and it's a very proud moment, I would say. You know, as an Australian, to see forward-thinking approach. I mean, governments around the world are looking for ways to, you know, better make sure they get the best value out of their IT budgets, and I think having the Gov CMS is the term they've coined. You know, so having the departments work together towards like a best-of-breed solution for Drupal that meets their needs is a huge step in that direction.
Yeah, I think I dropped out, so I'm not sure you heard what I was
We didn't hear anything.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's a huge win, I think, for open source and for Drupal. You know, we've been working with government departments over the last few years, and there's been a huge adoption of Drupal in government. So I think it's testament to the success of that, of how Drupal has worked really well. So yeah, we're pretty excited. I mean, we built our own Drupal distribution called AGov, which we've been trying to encourage government departments to adopt. And so, I mean, I think for us, it's a huge bit of news, and we're really excited about it.
Okay, that's a conversation that I'd really like to continue with the two of you very soon, but you've got a session to do now, and you were way too interesting, so we spent a little bit long talking. So what I want to do now is let one of you go to screen share and give us your session. Everyone who's listening in the future, the podcast piece is going to end now, but on the podcast page for this podcast on acquia.com, which you can find at acquia.com/podcasts something as the landing page, and there's also a Jams Drupal Camp landing page in there. There'll be some text, and there'll be the slides embedded, if there are any slides. I forget if it's only demo. And the actual session presented by Kim and Larry with really interesting code. So this session got me excited when I saw it at Drupal South, because this was the first time that I saw people walking me through, hey, Drupal 8 does all this cool stuff, and this is how Drupal 7 looks, and this is how Drupal 8 looks, and then tying in all of the methods and the controllers and the dependency injection into bite-sized examples. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for the podcast part. Thanks for taking the time to talk with me.
Great. Thank you.
Right. And now, goodbye, podcast. On to the session. Jam's Drupal Camp with, and I took the liberty of changing the title of your session, Drupal 8, Live and in Code. Everything you wanted to know about Drupal 8, but were afraid to ask. Lee Rowland and Kim Pepper, take it away.
All right, I'll do the screen sharing, if that's okay.
All right.
Let me just make sure.
Let's hope this works.
Yeah, let's hope we don't regret that decision.
I've tried to do this before.
And can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. And I'm presenting. Can you see the presentation?
No.
Okay. So when you go to present, in a new window.
You might not. You might have to take it out of present. You might have to like just zoom it up. Yeah. No, still seeing you.
All right. Handshake. I can fix that. We can edit this later.
Well, yeah, we'll cut all this out. Sorry, audience.
All right. Let me just screen share with the right screen. That would make more sense. How's that?
Yes. Woo. Success.
Wow. All right. So I'm going to turn my thing off now and watch you guys do your stuff.
Okay. Oh, can you still see it?
Yep, it's all good.
Okay.
Right. So I mean, I don't know what you can see from your end, Kim, but we're on the Drupal 8 in a nutshell slide. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Okay, we have the technology. Yeah. So basically, we're going to try and cover everything that we can in a short time, but there is, obviously a limited amount of time and some big things changed in Drupal 8. I mean, as we were writing this presentation, one of the things that fell out was that the main pattern in Drupal 8 is learn once, apply everywhere. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the theme of our presentation. And this just fell out as we were writing it. There's a lot more consistency in Drupal 8 than you were used to in Drupal 7. And this is for like developers. We're not talking, we're talking about everyone. We're talking about site builders in UX, etc. But for this session, we're mainly going to be talking about development changes. And in that respect, in particular, there's a lot more consistency in Drupal 8. And so we've coined the phrase learn once, apply everywhere. We're not going to show any screenshots, but we're going to do our best.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that there are some major architectural changes under the hood. So I mean, Drupal's had a tradition of kind of doing that over the last few major releases, but this time it's quite significant. But I guess one of the things that we want to do is reassure people not to be afraid that essentially these changes aren't going to disturb too much. And we'll actually be able to give you some examples of sort of what Drupal 7 code looks like and what you can see in Drupal 8.
So some of the big changes are PHP 5.4. So we've gone to a mostly object-oriented paradigm. And I mean, one of the things that PHP 5.4 gives is better performance. And if you actually run on PHP 5.5, there's a potential for better performance again. Can you go back a couple of slides? We've incorporated a lot of external libraries. Lots of things are being cleaned up for greater consistency. There are less arrays as domain objects and less Drupalisms, and there's a vastly improved developer experience. There's been a lot of work on that. And one thing to note, less code doesn't necessarily mean better developer experience.
And,
so
I'll throw in as well that there's been a massive renaissance in PHP in the last few years, and it's really it's around first of all the maturity of PHP and allowing namespaces and actually proper allowing classes and those kinds of things, and that's actually been enhanced by the fact that tools like Composer are really allowing us a nice way to share and reuse code across projects. So this is what's driven this massive change.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the first time we've truly leveraged these external open source projects. Previously, we really only PHP ones particularly. We really only used jQuery in the past, and currently we have 12 projects in Vendor, 13 Symfony components in there, including dependency injection, routing, the HTTP kernel, and foundation. And what we've kind of been saying is that if you learn Drupal from PHP from Drupal, well, then Drupal 8 will teach you modern PHP from a familiar setting. And we shared a lot of our PHP 4 legacy, and we embrace PHP 5.4. And my personal experience, and I don't know for Kim, is that learning Drupal 8 makes you a better developer on the whole, and that's a huge win.
Yep. So
yes.
I think Lee mentioned this already. So basically, it's built upon modern PHP. So minimum requirement is PHP 5.4 now. There's a huge amount of object-oriented PHP. Most of it's object-oriented. There's still a fair amount of procedural stuff, and that means we're talking with classes, interfaces, namespaces, and also we mentioned PSR 0, which is the standard for that. But there's also PSR 4 now, which is in Drupal core. So this is another change, and that basically means just moving a few of the directories out of your hub, which we'll go with a little bit in a moment.
And so people have said to me in the past, they freak out when they see backslashes in class names in PHP, and I think there's nothing to be afraid of there. And a good example of why we need namespaces and what they allow us to do is that you have two things with the same name. So, for example, we have a request class. We have 3 request classes in Drupal. We have a Guzzle request class, we have a Symfony request class, and we also have a Zend request class. And so, because they're namespaced, we can have 3 classes with the same name. So, we're in Drupal 7, we would have had these massive class names, and would have had to reference it by the full name every time. With Drupal 8, because we've got namespaces, we can refer to things by their short name after we've sort of imported them into the scope of our file, and it's a lot easier to write. To write your code a lot cleaner.
So, I mean, just a quick example of what an object-oriented PHP class looks like. I mean, many of you might be familiar with this already, but essentially we're declaring our namespaces first. So we're actually not having those collisions that Lee just mentioned. We're able to bring in other classes using the use statement. And then essentially in this example, we're writing a class that implements an interface, and all we need to do is just have our functions nested inside that class. It's pretty straightforward syntax.
So one of the things we get from the PSR 0 or PSR 4 folder structure is we get Composer's autoloader, which means we don't have to declare all of our files in our info files anymore, which is a huge win. Just put your files in the right folder and they're automatically available as soon as you use them in another file. And because we have first-class interfaces for everything, rather than just arbitrary arrays, we can actually enforce things. And so, if there's a contract you have to follow, and it means that it's a lot simpler for us to swap things in and out. It gives us the ability to say, okay, well, I don't want that. I can use a different version as long as it implements the interface. It doesn't matter where it actually came from.
So. We're going to talk just a little bit about the kind of basic fundamental architecture. So the big thing I think that's changed is this concept of dependency injection. So I just wanted to go through and explain what that actually means to try and sort of demystify it a bit. So essentially what dependency injection means is that instead of creating our classes or calling functions directly in our code, we get our dependencies passed in through the constructor. So we're not sort of doing a lookup, or we're not calling the database directly. We can actually get the actual database connection passed in. We can set it just as a property on our class, and then from then on, when we refer to the database, we're referring to this keyword, the local database property, and doing our queries on that. So by doing that, it has a number of benefits. Basically, we're not tied to procedural code. We're able to test this class by, say, mocking out what the connection is. So we could put a stub or a fake connection in there, and then test that this database gets called, and actually test this code in isolation. And the second concept around this is that there's a dependency injection container. So what that means is that instead of you writing code to pass in all these objects, you just write some YAML file that basically tell you how to wire all these things together, and then the Symfony dependency injection component actually does all the instantiation for you. So the steps are, you write your class, and all you need to do then is in the root of your module add in a services.yaml file, and that will actually load all of the instantiate those objects for you. So this is just yeah.
So in the example, you would declare what you depend on. So this one here is an example of a service example is the class name, and the only thing the constructor needs is the database. And you don't really care how you make the database, or where it comes from, or how it's instantiated, or what constructor arguments it needs. The Symfony DI component does it all for you. And so essentially, if that database could be, MySQL database, but there's no reason why it could be completely swapped out with Mongo implementation or something else altogether. As long as it conforms to the interface, it doesn't really. Your code doesn't need to care what database is. All it needs to know is that it gets a database.
And I mean, these are essentially called services in the Symfony world. So what we're doing here is declaring a new service. But there's other extension points in Drupal 8 as well. We're not limited to just services. So we've got in Drupal 7 there was a similar concept. We had things like being able to write an inc file. So if you had, say, you had an alternative session implementation, Drupal had some limited support for actually allowing you to swap out the actual file that was being used for that. So this is sort of like a much more sophisticated version of that concept, if you're familiar with that in Drupal 7.
Yeah, so say the forum manager is a service that the forum manager module defines. So it's like a concrete example, and so its responsibilities for doing all the interactions with the forum database tables, and so generating the list of posts and etc., and working with taxonomy, and because the forum default implementation is tied to SQL, if you don't like that, you can swap in a different service altogether and back it with whatever you want. As long as it implements the forum manager interface, it doesn't matter if it uses MySQL. We could store stuff in files. It's completely swappable, and we couldn't do this easily in Drupal 7 because essentially, once you register a function, you've got to override the whole function. So like Kim said before, session.inc. I mean, menu.inc is a good example. You might not have liked the way the menu tree loading worked in Drupal 7, and for you to change that, you've essentially had to copy the whole menu.inc file and just change that one piece that you needed, and then register that as an alternate menu.inc file. And because we've got object-oriented code in Drupal 8, if you want to change just one method on a service, you can just subclass it, change that method, and swap that service, and it's a lot less repetition and a lot less dancing around.
So one of the key changes that's occurred in Drupal 8 is just how we handle page routing and forms. So basically, it's worth just reviewing what is it that hook menu is actually doing. It's actually doing quite a lot, and this is one of the things that we tried to pick apart in Drupal 8. So it actually first of all, handles routing, which is basically if you get a request on this particular path, then call this function or call this particular code. But it was also doing things like default menu items, local tasks, and local actions. And there was actually quite a lot. While there was a lot of shortcuts in there, they were fairly convenient. There was a lot of hidden magic in hook menu. There was things going on in there that there's a massive kind of documentation page on Hook Menu to tell you what all the special hook keys are and how you can actually use it. And so I think putting that all out in Drupal 8's actually demystified a whole lot of what's going on there.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the criticisms, I guess, of Drupal 7 is that to know what's happening in menu.inc, you need to be like a core guru. You need to be a wizard because there's just so many different use cases and responsibilities that are being handled in there. And so, hopefully, one of the positive outcomes of splitting these responsibilities into their separate components is that it's much more understandable for people that are coming in to core afresh, and the more eyes, the more maintainers, the better. One of the wins here again about the Learn Once Apply Everywhere is that the routing system uses the same structure as Symfony 2. So you learn it here, you can apply it to Symfony 2 as well. And that's, like we said, Learn Once Apply Everywhere outside Drupal even.
All right, so I mean, this is just a quick review. This like an example of Drupal 7. So we're going to give you a code example of Drupal 7 and then what it looks like in Drupal 8. So here we've essentially got our own example. We're calling a page callback, which is just this function name. We pass in page callback, and then we just have to have a function that actually returns something like a string. To do the same thing in Drupal 8, it's essentially two steps. First of all, we're creating a class because we're all object-oriented, and that class extends ControllerBase. The ControllerBase is a base class that has a whole bunch of helper methods on it, just to make it easier for you to write your own controller class. And then the second thing is just wiring that up using the routing YAML file, so which sort of declares some of the metadata around how that route should be handled. So here's just a simple example. We've got our page example controller. Up top, we've got to put it under this special PSR 0 directory structure. So we've got this will actually change with PSR 4. We won't need as many folders, but essentially the idea is that the namespace we're putting it in matches the directory structure that file in. So all we need to do is write a new class, extend ControllerBase, and then just have a public function. And in this case, we're just calling it page example. And because we want to allow things to change, we can actually just return a render array here. This is a pretty standard. You could do it in Drupal 7 as well.
And one thing to note there is you've got the use statement at the top, so that basically imports ControllerBase with its full namespace, but then we say extends ControllerBase, and so from there on through the file we can refer to the class by the short name. And you'll notice also in the middle there there's this T, and we'll come back to that in a minute.
Yep. And then the second step is just our routing YAML file. So everything starts with the module name, of course, so page example routing YAML. And in this, we're just declaring, first of all, the path. Well, first of all, we have a unique name for the route. So in Drupal 7, in Hook Menu, the path was always the unique key for the route. But what we're doing is actually having a sort of a machine name for every path in the system. And then the path attribute is the actual URL path that will fire this route. Then all we need to do, we've got this defaults and the content counter that just declares the class that we're actually wanted to call and the method name on that. So that's what the two columns means. Is basically that's the part at the end is just the method name. And then similar to Hook Menu, we actually just define what our access parameters are. We're basically using the same permission system, and we're just telling us that you need to have a special permission called access examples to be able to view this route.
So one of the things that's worth pointing out here is the page example.example, the machine name of the route. Throughout core, great effort has been gone to refer to all links using their machine name instead of the path. So if you don't want /user to be @/user, you can go in and modify the route and change the path, but all the other links will keep working to the new route because it's been done by a machine name. And that's something that we could never do in Drupal 7 without lots and lots of juggling and working around. So that's a huge win in Drupal 8, in my opinion. And it's quite a common client requirement that they don't want user/password to be a user/password. They want it somewhere else. Some other things you can do in the routing file is you can put format requirements. So you can say, okay, if it's if the client is requesting JSON or HAL or XML, we want it to route it to this particular controller. So you can do everything that you could do with the hook menu and then some here. But yeah, we'll talk a bit more about that later.
Yeah, I mean, another thing you can do is restrict whether you can access that route with a GET or a POST request. So there's a whole bunch of other things that actually work quite nicely with that. So ControllerBase, as I mentioned before, is providing us with some helper functions, and it's interesting to just compare some of the procedural functions that you would have used in Drupal 7 are now actual methods on the ControllerBase class that you can use. So we'd have to go through all of the examples here, but essentially there's pretty much a mapping from the old ones to the new ones. Instead of having to use like Drupal GoTo, we've actually got a redirect, and I think the key thing is in most of these we're actually using the route name. We're not using paths anymore because we've got a unique machine name for that. That just allows us a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, and basically what these methods give us also is the ability to unit test with PHP unit our controllers. Because anytime you call a function in the global namespace, like the ones in the left-hand column there, you need a fully bootstrapped Drupal, whereas the ones on the right can be stubbed out, and you can essentially test that your controller does what it needs without having to bootstrap Drupal, which means you can have PHP unit testing and test what your controller is outputting with far less overhead and a lot quicker than you would with simple test.
And one of the other things to mention is just that we are using dependency injection for a lot of our services, which we looked at before. But what if you actually need to pass in a dependency into your new controller class? So there is an answer for that. So rather than actually having to go and create a new service every time you want to create a new controller, there's this dependency injection factory pattern. So what that does is basically passes the you have implement this method, the static method called create. Essentially what that does is just gets the actual dependency injection container passed in to your class, get calls on that create function, and then that basically allows you to then call from the container any of those dependencies that you need and then pass them to your constructor. So it's essentially one additional method on your class, but what that gives you is the ability just to not have to go through and create services every time you want to create a new folder.
And so, like, if you're not familiar with a lot of these elements of object-oriented PHP, this might look a little bit overwhelming, but essentially, once you've constructed an object using the constructor, you have the this object available. But before you do that, you don't have it available. And so what this create method, because it has the static keyword in there, basically that means that method can be called before the object is instantiated. So what that is kind of like a pre-flight check, I guess. The dependency container or the controller resolver says to your controller, it checks if it implements the interface, and if it does, it says, oh, I know you need something before I actually build you. What do you need? And this create method basically says, okay, I'm going to take care of building it for you. And so the return new static basically says it means just return a new instance of myself and take those dependencies from the container.
Yeah, it's a nice little trick, I guess, in order to be able to get access to that container and still use dependency injection, which we said offers a huge amount of benefits. So how do you handle forms? So forms are done in a similar way. So instead of extending controller base, we extend from form base, and we just need to add our root definition for our form in the routing YAML file that we talked about earlier. So a form, instead of, like I said before, it extends from form base, and there's a few methods on there that we can implement. So first of all, we don't have a kind of special key name for the form based on the function name. So that was kind of a bit of a Drupalism there. We actually just explicitly return a form ID in the getFormID function. And then we actually have specific methods for building a form. And we're still using form arrays, using the form API. That hasn't really changed in Drupal 8. But this build form function will get called to return the actual form that we're building. And then we've got methods there for handling form submission and form validation. We haven't put them all here, but essentially the main point to look at in this example is that we've actually got proper methods on a class to actually implement those things, and all of the form functionality is nicely contained within a single class.
Yeah, instead of scattered across a whole lot of files.
Yep. And then just to wire up our form for routing, so instead of, again, we have the form triggered from a path. We've got a unique key for it, but we trigger it from a specific URL path. And then for the defaults, instead of saying that this is going to return content, we've got this special form key, which basically tells Drupal that we should implement this as a form. And the rest is fairly the same as the controller stuff. All right, so what happened to hook menu? So hook menu is gone. It got removed quite a long time ago now. All of the routing part, first of all, got split off, and we're using Symfony routing for that. The menu links, the part that actually created menu links whenever you declared a menu item, is now in a
anything that you gave a type of menu item normal, menu normal type, I think was the constant in Drupal 7. It was created a menu link in the UI. That's what this is replacing. Yeah.
So the key point here is that we've got unique keys with the menu links, and we're actually tying them. We're passing them specific route names. So again, we're not using paths.
And we're also, which is not shown in this example here, but you explicitly nominate the parent. So in Drupal 7, you would have like path foo and path foo/bar, and if in the menu structure, foo/bar would automatically appear underneath foo because of the path. But that's kind of was an implicit assumption in Drupal 7 that we don't have in Drupal 8. You can actually wire up foo to be on its own, and then /bar could also be part of come under /foo in the menu, even though their paths aren't nested under each other, and so there's an explicit parent key that's not shown here.
So local actions are also split out into their own YAML file.
Yeah, these are the ones that, like the big button on the admin content page that says, create new content. These are the big buttons that you see at the top of the page.
Yep. So we just need to specify what route they appear on, and also local tasks are also now in their own YAML file.
Yeah, and these ones are the tabs you would have, like view, edit, translate, etc., that you would see on a node page, for example.
The sub tabs, yeah.
Sub tabs, yeah.
So I think the great benefit from the developer experience is that these are all kind of nicely separated now. They're not all thrown into the mix, and you can actually go and find things that you want to change quite easily. It's also worth mentioning that the routing system handles, like we mentioned before, responding to different content based off the accept header that's coming in. I mean, and that's actually the real reason that Symfony routing was put into Drupal 8 to begin with. It was basically to be able to support having different response types based off the actual accept headers that are coming in. So a lot of stuff is a side effect of that decision.
Yeah, so I mean, the modals is one of the best examples there. Like in Drupal 7, to do something in modal, we'd had that Node.js or JS extra element in the path that was just to tell Drupal whether someone was asking to see it in a modal or not. In Drupal 8, you know, the client, which is the browser, when it sends the AJAX request, it sends an accept header saying I want to see it in a modal, and the routing system in Dependency says, well, don't send that off through the node page view, send it off through the dialog controller, and the dialog controller says, all right, well, if I had have seen that originally, I would have been seeing the node. It gets the node, renders it, wraps it in a dialog, spits it out back. You don't get the menus, you don't get the blocks, you just get the, yeah, so that's pretty cool stuff that we couldn't do in the past.
Yeah. Definitely a lot cooler. And there's a whole bunch of documentation there that we can add to the notes at the end on routing.
Yeah.
But the other major system that's gone through change is the configuration system. Basically, if you're familiar with configuration in Drupal 7, it was all about the variables table. So that's actually completely gone now.
Yeah, so we've got the concept of an active and a staging store in Drupal 8. We've kind of jumped ahead of myself here, but up until recently, all your config was stored in YAML files, that for both representations of that. But now, for performance reasons, the active store is in the database, but it can be exported back to YAML and then deployed to another site. So whereas in the past, we would have dramas getting the configured text formats, and we would use something like features to manage our configuration. Now in Drupal 8, that stuff can be exported natively, and it makes for a much better development workflow. So when you used to use variable get and variable set, now you can use the config API, and so everything is keyed by its name. So for example, forum module ships with some settings, and so they live in forum module inside a folder called config install, and it's called forum.settings.yaml. And inside that YAML file, we have a vocabulary. So this example here shows that we're getting Drupal's config is getting us the forum.settings file, and then from that we're getting the vocabulary, and we can also set the values back. One thing that we couldn't do in Drupal 7 that we can do in Drupal 8 is multiple sets before a write. So see how we have to call save on the end of the set there? We could call set vocabulary hoo-ha, set something else, chain them all together, and at the very end call save, and it would only be one write, whereas Drupal 7, obviously you'd write to the variables table for each one of those. So as you see at the top there, we've got access to the config in procedural code using that global Drupal singleton, which is that /Drupal and the static method config. But if you're doing object-oriented code, you can get the config factory service from the container and inject that in. And yeah, so you should try and avoid using the /Drupal object in any OO code.
Yeah, and I think also just to mention that there's still a fair amount of work going on in terms of performance tuning now with the config system, but the actual API is not changing. So, like Lee mentioned before, originally the active store for all the config was in YAML files. That got moved to the database. The important thing is that all of this stuff is now nicely decoupled through interfaces and those kinds of services. So that really, if you're interested in performance, there's a huge amount of options there for when you're deploying to production to be able to plug in a Redis store or a Memcache store for your active store. You've got options there to allow you to implement that how you want. Also worth mentioning, just there's support in Drupal 8 for the same sort of thing that you might have found with system settings form in Drupal 7. So just a helper base class there to allow you to create a form for setting and getting those things. So say you've got a module and you want to write some config for it, you can extend from this config form base, and that's extending from form base, so you get all the same methods in there. But if you call the parent build form on this, that will do things like add in the submit button and set the theme and those kinds of things to make sure that you actually it looks like the admin thing. And then when you submit the form, it'll do things like, set you saved your settings message back to the user. The main difference is that in the submit form now, it doesn't automatically just convert everything into config and save it like it did in Drupal 7. System settings form in Drupal 7 actually turned any of the form values into variables and save them in the variables table. In Drupal 8 it doesn't do that. You just need to save the config yourself before you hold parent submit form.
Yeah, and that's just removing another one of the Drupalisms or the assumptions in there that every field in the form ended up in a variable, and you see that if you go and try and export stuff in Drupal 7, say strong arm, you'll end up with these variables like active tab, from anything with a vertical tab set. It was saved to the variable table because it was submitted with the form, but it really didn't belong in the table. So yeah, this removes that assumption. So one of the biggest wins in the config system is the concept of a config entity, and these are kind of developed from the CTools exportables, and they came out of the porting and the bringing of views into core. So one of the added benefits of having views available is that a lot of the APIs in core have been driven around and by that conversion. And so a config entity is essentially anything where you could have a 1 to n like values of it. So a field instance, a node type, a block type, an image style, a view, a filter format, a tour. And these are all used as config entity systems. So all of those objects are exportable and deployable by default because they go through this config system. They're wrapped in the Entity API. So if you're familiar with, for example, the Entity API module in Drupal 7, and when we talk about Entity API later on, we'll touch on that a bit more. It's a consistent API. So in the past, filter formats or a node type or a field info, they were all separate, unique APIs, and they're now consistent. And so you learn this once and you apply it everywhere. And I said before block types, and it's worth noting that in Drupal 8 you can have block types and they are fieldable and translatable. So a lot of the config modules that you used to need, you don't need anymore. So if we have a look at some examples for this unified entity API and how it applies to the configuration entities, if you want a node type, you can get its storage controller and you can create it and you pass in the values. But then you've got methods like save on it. If you want to get the name of the node type, you can use the label method. If you want to get its ID, you can use the ID method. But that also applies to all those things I talked about earlier. So fields, field instances, block types, tools, filter formats, all of these are consistent. There's not, you don't need node type get types, which is a function you used to use to get stuff about node types. It's just all available on that object with first-class methods. And because, as we said before, the storage is swappable, I mean, that storage controller, it could be writing it to a YAML file, could be writing it to the database, could be storing it in Redis, it could be doing anything. And so, yeah, it's far more consistent, and the developer experience because of that is far greater.
Yeah, I mean, you might have been familiar when you're trying to find an ID on something before, and for a node it was NID, for a user it was UID, a taxonomy was PID. So having a unified interface just makes, there's no kind of having to learn that stuff. It's just
yeah, I mean, how many times have there's the function entity extract IDs in Drupal 7, which was to dance around that stuff, and yeah, you don't need to deal with that, anymore. So yeah, goodbye and good riddance to that function. One of the things, sorry, you go, mate.
No, I was going to say, and one of the nice things with the config system is that you can actually put a whole bunch of default config in just your config/install folder, and when you enable your module, that config will just get imported. And so things like if you've wrangled with features in Drupal 7, this is basically the equivalent of being able to have all of those things just be there and available and as exports, and then when you enable your module, they get loaded and imported.
Yeah, and it also allows for a lot more reuse. I mean, in Drupal 7 we have this notion, and I'll keep going back to the forum module, but we have this notion of forum containers, and it's basically a flag on a forum, which is basically a taxonomy term, to say, is it a container or is it a forum? Now, in the past we had custom form, custom submission handlers, custom everything. Now, because we can ship fields by default, we don't bother, and we just put a locked field instance in the forum config module, and the field API creates the field for us, and it's it's just a simple on-off checkbox. and all of that custom code is gone.
Okay. There's still, I guess, there's still some work, or there's still, I guess, a lack of real-world experience with actual the workflows that will actually occur in the wild. I think there's been a couple of blog posts out there about how to do deployments of config in Drupal 8. But generally, the approach is going to be you have your local development environment, you have your active store, and you're able to export all your config out of that, and then put it into a staging folder. And when you move that to, say, production environment, you can then load that config from your staging environment into the production's active store.
And there's a nice diff UI in core to tell you what it's going to change when you sync your staging from staging to active. So your config from staging to active. So yeah, you do get a chance to review what it's going to do before you bring it in.
I mean, and Drupal 8 doesn't really prescribe any particular workflow for how you can do that. It's essentially just providing, I guess, the API for config import and export. So I expect there'll probably will be a lot of work done around something similar to features, or being able to bundle up some of this config and actually develop some pretty unique workflows around how that stuff works once Drupal 8's released.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the great benefits out of this config system also is that everything is translatable, and this is in core. You don't need 15 squillion config modules to do this. All of these config objects have a schema, and the schema prescribes what the fields are and what sort of data type they are, and so that's used for validation. So, for example, if you've got a text field that takes a numeric value, when it's written to the back to the store, it's written back as a numeric value because the schema tells it that it needs to be numeric, even though the form from the browser will be sending it as text. And so in the schema, you nominate what parts are translatable and the caption that would be for translating it. And so we have config translation module in core. You turn that on and you can start translating.
Yeah, and there's also a couple of other API changes that are around the configuration system. So you might have realized in Drupal 7, you pretty much use variable get and set for everything, but there was a few instances where that actually wasn't that appropriate. So there's an API there for state. So if you've just got some flag that you need to set, like a menu rebuild needed, for example, previously that would have been stored in the variables table, but this state is essentially using like a key value store behind, and it's meant to be stuff that's sort of transitional. There's also a settings API, so if you make an explicit config setting in your settings.php file, you can actually call that through the settings API directly.
Yeah, so this one's largely to deal with settings.php, essentially.
Yeah. And there's one that's not mentioned here, which is just a key value store that you can actually use as well if you've just got something similar to that. All right, and another message.
Yeah, this brings us to the plugin system, and this is probably my favourite section, I would say, of Drupal 8. And basically, what we've got is it's been derived from the CTools plugin concept. So if you've ever written an Access or say a content type plugin for CTools for panels or page manager, or the CTools plugins are used for a lot of other tutoring modules like entity reference, selection widgets, and address field. Lots of modules use it already. We've got that now as a solid API in core. So this is the learn once everywhere, like nirvana of Drupal core. Pretty much anything that was a hook info in Drupal 7 is now a plugin, and it's a first-class object. It's got an interface, so if you want to create, for example, a block or a widget or a format or an entity type or a local action or any of these things, you create your plugin and you implement interface. If you don't implement interface properly, you'll be told by Drupal, you need to implement additional method. Whereas in Drupal 7, there was like a semi-random bag of hooks that you had to implement. So for a field formatter or a block, you had to implement these 4 hooks that, that they were arbitrary. They had nothing tying them together. Now they're tied together by an interface. If you want to provide Many of these disparate hooks are all gone, and so you learn this subsystem once, you can apply it everywhere. And in most cases, you can inherit from a base class. So, say for example, you didn't like the way the link formatter worked, and yes, we have link module in core. You want to do something differently. Whereas in Drupal 7, you'd have to copy those 4 hooks and duplicate all of that code and change one tiny thing, and then keep it in sync every time a new release came out. Drupal 8, you subclass the link formatter and you change the one little bit you want. You can call to the parent if you want 95% of its logic. It's just such a pleasure to work with, and rather than have these hooks, scattered across your .module file or these .ints, they're in one file in one class. So if you want another instance of that formatter, you copy and paste the file, change the name, change the class name, and you've got another plugin. It's another formatter. It works in entirety. It's you can learn this, and there's so many subsystems that you're on top of.
I think we just found the thing that Lee's most passionate about in Drupal.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, let's consider blocks in a pre-plugin where you would have 4 disparate hooks. You have hook block info, you have hook block save, hook block configure, and hook block view. And it's common. You only had one place to declare these blocks in your module. So if you needed 4 blocks, you had to do these giant switch statements and lots of code duplication. I mean, we've got the for module up there that only had 2. It's not the worst one that I've seen, but yeah, the more blocks you added, the harder it got. So with Drupal 8, if you want to create a block, you create a new PHP class, you add an annotation, and a lot of people think, what is annotation? It's code with in comments, but it's quite common in the PHP world and in other software development frameworks and languages. So we're not inventing something here just for another Drupalism. We're actually following what everyone else does. And so, yeah, you have for real methods on that block class, like default configuration, where you nominate the default configuration.
Let's have a look.
Yeah.
So this is an example of how you would build a block in Drupal 8. So the first part is the annotation, which as you can see is in the comment, and essentially what we're doing here is using this special block annotation block. And we're specifying a unique ID for it that we can reference later, and then just basically some example, a label and a category. But the real fun comes down below, where essentially we're able to extend from a block-based class. So again, it's a nice helper class that does a lot of the building stuff for us, and then essentially we can focus on building our block, returning render arrays like we did. And again, each block is a self-contained unit. We're not trying to shove all of these blocks into the same procedural function. They're all nicely contained. So it's going to be easier for the developers to find things and read the code.
Yeah, and I mean, for another example, if you've got 2 blocks that are very similar and they only vary by one thing, you can create an abstract base class in between the 2 of them that extends from block base, does 95% of the commonality, and then you just implement those 2 things that distinct about those 2 in the one method in the classes that come lower down the chain from it. And yeah, it's much less code duplication, much nice and neat and tidy.
Yeah. And basically, plugins is everywhere in Drupal 8. So in Drupal 7, if you're using CTools plugins, you probably found a handful of there's quite a lot of modules that were using CTools plugins, but it's been adopted pretty much whole for most of Drupal core. So basically, that's a little infographic that shows you just how many different types of plugins there are. But it's just, if you learn the concept of plugins, you can apply them everywhere.
Yeah, and these are common to all of them. So whereas in the past you used to have to know the magic return values that you needed for hook node info or hook entity info or hook field formatter info, or I could go on. Now you just create a class, implement an interface, and it works. And you want another one, you copy and paste it.
Everyone's probably familiar with the fact that there's migrating core now. So I think there's support now for Drupal 6 to Drupal 8. But again, that was actually made a whole lot easier. The work to do that was made a whole lot easier by the fact that they're extensively using plugins and core plugins. There's a session there by Check that talks through how you actually do migrations, and it's pretty straightforward. I was pretty surprised seeing that session, just how easy it is to actually do migrations. And you may not even need to write plugins to do migrations, but if you do, they're pretty easy to do. All right, moving on.
So, yeah, we're still going for time. We right to keep going? Jeffrey?
James,
That's cool. This is great stuff, and, you know, absolutely.
Right. Well, brings us to entities and fields, and if you thought I was excited about plugins, well, wait till you see me talk. This is great. Yeah, I mean, everything. You know, if you had entities in the past, or you had things in the past where you were creating, you know, custom CRUD, so like create, you know, retrieve, update, delete type stuff, you can actually use the field API for that stuff, like we talked about earlier for the forum module, for example. And look, custom entities in Drupal 7 were painful, and they were often avoided. Yeah, but every entity is a first-class object. So, like, there is Node that implements Node interface, and if you don't like the way Node does something, you can say my Node implements Node interface and use that instead. You know, it's a common API for everything, as we talked about before, and this is my favorite part. There's no more of this Node field food language non-zero value crap. It's a common, it's just an API. You don't need to care about what language it's in. You just get the values back from with asking. And yeah, the handlers are all swappable. So if you don't like the access plugin that ships with core for handling access control for Node, you can swap in your own. If you don't like the way the storage is handled for taxonomy terms, you can swap in your own. So yeah, this is so much work has gone in by people behind the scenes here to make this much cleaner.
So, I mean, this is just, I guess, probably more a site-building thing, but there's a whole bunch of new field types available in Drupal 8 now. So there's link, email, comment, or comment settings as a field, which I know Lee was one of the main drivers behind getting into Drupal 8. But simple things like a date field, which you would normally assume would actually be there, wasn't there, was in Contrib until Drupal 8, and entity reference. So these are kind of hugely, I mean, entity reference is a hugely powerful module in terms of modeling structured data and structured content. So having that in core, I think it's being used in quite a lot of places now too. So big wins there.
Yeah, some other things we've got in core is display and form modes. So you know, I mean, common site building technique in Drupal 7 is to add view modes to represent different themed implementations of a particular entity. And you used to have to do that with, you know, custom hooks or contrib modules, but there's now a UI in core that lets you add those view modes. And again, these are config entities, so they're built in the config system, they're deployable. We have form modes. So form mode is the same as a view mode, but it applies to the form. So when you view the user account edit page as the admin, you know, you see one set of forms. But when you view the user account admin form as on the register form, you see a different set of fields for the form modes. And so that's going to unlock a huge number of things in Contrib as we go further forward. Things like inline entity form will benefit from that. And so a lot of the basic display suite functionality is also in this display mode. So a lot of base fields are using formatters and widgets. So if you want to use a different widget for the title, or you want to control the way the formatter outputs the title, these things are going through the field API, so it's consistent. It's not that 90% of the fields use this, and then if you want to use a title or the created data or something, it's something completely different. There's a lot that's all made consistent. Yep. And so, yeah.
And you can actually create view modes through the UI. So I mean, Display Suite is one of those real useful utility modules. I'm sure there's going to be a use for some of the layout part of it in Drupal 8, but a lot of the kind of basic stuff that was just missing from Drupal 7 is now there. We should also mention that I think Lee, you were behind this as well, but custom blocks are fieldable as well. So if you ever needed to use, you know, the Bean module, or there was a couple of those.
Panel panes, yeah.
Panel panes. You don't need to anymore. You can use just custom blocks in Drupal, and you can add fields to them. So. it gets all the benefits of having revisions and those kinds of things. Right.
So, the main building blocks of the programmer's point of view of the field API that you were exposed to in 777, such as a field type, so for example, link, telephone, etc., and a formatter, which controlled the way it was output, and a widget, which controlled the form fields for it. These are all plugins now too. So, yeah, it's not a random bag of hooks. It's a defined interface. You implement the interface, or you extend a base class, and you're away. You want to copy and paste, same as we talked about earlier.
And I think this is Lee's favourite slide, which is...
yeah, so in Drupal 7 you used to do this node field foo language node zero value. In Drupal 8 you would go node title value, node field foo value. The language handling is much simpler, and so because node is an object that implements entity interface and content interface and node interface, you have certain things that Drupal guarantees to you will be available to you, as a contract of this interface. And so, yeah, there's no more random arrays. You won't need, if you've got a solid, IDE, you won't need to go through the rigmarole of opening, setting a debug point or outputting to see what's available to you, because as you start typing, your IDE will give you completion of what's available. Yeah, and that applies too to, like, there's a whole discovery API around fields. So things like field info field and field info instances that you used to need to call in Drupal 7 to get information about fields are available in Drupal 7. Drupal 8. These are available on the actual entity. So you can go node get property definitions, and it'll give you a list of the definitions. You can go node field foobar get field definition, and it'll give you the definition for that field. And this is the same. There's like you can go get field definition, get settings, or get label, or get description, or is required, and get all of this information about these fields from the entity itself. And so obviously this powers a lot of the REST stuff because everything's inconsistent across the board, but this applies to a term or a comment or a user or a custom block. It's not just a node, it's consistent right across the board. And again, so if you learn this once, you can apply it everywhere. And if you've got a solid IDE, there's a great API discovery right there as a coding.
Yeah, and that's going to be, that's a massive developer experience improvement right there. Just much more unified API around that stuff. So we're going to just delve into the front end briefly. We don't have a huge amount of detail talking about the changes in the front end because we wanted to keep it more of a developer focus. But obviously one of the biggest changes is just in the fact that we've adopted Twig. So instead of node tpl.php files, basically you've got the equivalent with just calling it html.twig. And the key things around it, I think, are, first of all, there's no PHP execution in Twig files, so it's going to be safer. And because you're removing all of those PHP tags and you're only using some curly braces, it's actually going to be a lot simpler for front-end developers as well to work with templates.
And again, just really honing on our theme, if you learn this, it applies outside Drupal. Twig is widely adopted outside Drupal. I saw a CI framework during the week that used Twig to generate its Docker templates.
Yeah. And that actually could work a lot in our favour, as well as bringing in people from outside the community, coming in and being able to if they're familiar with Twig, they've worked on other projects that use Twig, they'll be able to jump straight in and start working with Drupal theme layer. So this is just a brief example of some Twig output. I won't go through it in detail, but it's a little bit, I think it's a lot cleaner than using PHP tags anywhere. And the main thing that you'll get used to is just the fact that we're using these moustache braces everywhere.
Yeah, and you have to agree that
two moustache braces either side of your variable is a lot cleaner than
open bracket question mark PHP cream. Your template's much more succinct and much more readable.
And this is just one. This is a session that Morton did at Drupal South, but I think he's done about 5 of these in recent months. So there's plenty of good sessions there on Twig that are out there. But one of the key things I think is that we've deprecated calling theme, and that's a big change again, I think. So basically, if you called theme inside some module code, it essentially rendered it as a string, and you'd be then passing maybe a big string of HTML.
Yeah, and if you had any assets attached to that, like JavaScript, CSS, and you serve that back from the cache, they're gone next time around, So yeah.
So the goal is to basically try and avoid turning things into just strings until we actually hit the theme layers at the very last moment. And what you can do this in Drupal 7 now, you can basically use render arrays and specify the theme hook to call. That's basically the standard in Drupal 8. So this is just a simple example of how you'd return a render array that renders an item list. So that's
previously that would have been called a theme item list. You know what I mean? So it's
another big change is that Drupal add JS and Drupal add CSS have been removed. And that no JavaScript will actually be loaded by default.
So this is a huge performance win for front end, obviously.
Yeah. So only the libraries that are actually being used are going to be displayed on the site. So that means in your module you actually need to declare what libraries that you actually require, such as jQuery or whatever, and then you need to make sure that you attach the library into a render array. So it's just Lee.
Yeah, you go.
I was just going to say this is just an example of Drupal blocks libraries file. Essentially, we're specifying our dependencies as we need jQuery and we need Drupal in this. So that will then mean that can we're declaring, I guess, that needs to be loaded. But then when we go to use it, we just specify this is the library that we actually want, and we're passing that into our render array, and that ensures that those libraries actually get loaded, and they're loaded at a later time in the pipeline. Also worth mentioning responsive. So responsive's in the default Drupal themes, but I think the key thing is it's also in the admin theme. So if you try to look at a Drupal 7 admin theme, and it doesn't really work that well in mobile, so that's good for content editors.
Yeah, and so, I mean, if you're following responsive web design trends, you'll know that there's been two alternative proposals around responsive images, the picture and the source set, and Drupal punted early on the picture element, and it looks like the picture element is going to get over the line. So what that means is we've got essentially the concept of the breakpoint module and a picture module in core, and yeah, you define just in your formatter, for each of the breakpoints which image style to use. And at the moment we've got a polyfill, but there's native browser support on its way, and so that all seems to mean that if you're viewing the device on a small resolution, they don't need to download the massive image, and they end up with the small first. So yeah, we're kind of something to be proud of in the Drupal community there, that we did make the right punt. But
yeah, it was a good gamble. And a whole bunch of HTML5 elements too. So that just means that things are going to work nicely on mobile devices. All right. There's actually quite a few more. Even though we're loading less libraries, there's more there that are available in core. So one of the key ones I think is the backbone and underscore libraries, and I think that's there for the quick edit functionality, so the in-page editing. But that actually is going to make a big difference for front-end developers. It's a really good way to kind of keep your JavaScript well structured, especially if you're doing a lot of JavaScript, like something like the in-place editor is doing. Yeah, and as we mentioned before, there's HTML5 Shiv and backwards compatibility with those standards. What else?
Yeah, we have WYSIWYG plugins. So we have WYSIWYG in core in Drupal 8. We didn't mention that, but that's a huge thing. And we're using CK Editor, and so yeah, we've got these to add new buttons to your toolbar. It's the same plugin system, and so yeah, consistency for the win. And yeah, so there's actually a patch in the queue now that adds the ability to embed an image style into the WYSIWYG editor, and it does it in a chunked way rather than a blob way. And so, yeah, I mean, we've got the tool module, which provides UI tools of content text sensitive. The edit module for quick edit, and yeah, we've got, as I said, Backbone underscore. I think Toolbar is the only one using Backbone, so I think there was some talk about that might be removed. But if you know more about the tool module, there was another session from Drupal South that you can go and check out, which is the URL there. So we're coming to the end. We've showed you all this cool stuff. When can you have it is the question that most people ask next. So there's a lot of DS cleanup still going on, but basically Drupal 8 beta will be released when the beta blockers are all resolved, and at the moment we're down to about under 30 of those, so we're getting very close, and the first RC will come out when all the criticals are resolved. So we've got a chart from the last This Week in Drupal Core showing progress there, but we're making good headway towards that, and if you want to keep abreast of where we are in terms of release, then certainly follow the This Week in Drupal Core announcements.
And that's that graph basically shows that we're kind of on top of criticals. If there's actually another graph that shows the number of criticals resolved on top of this, and so I mean there's just been a huge amount of effort going into Drupal 8 in recent months to reduce those and basically get us to a beta. And I mean there are still changes going on. Just recently there's still plenty of stuff moving around. So my advice is not really to build a site on Drupal 8 until at least we get a beta out, because we're pretty much guaranteed that those core APIs.
Yeah, when the beta comes out, there's an upgrade path between betas. So I mean, if you build something now with Drupal 8, there's no warranty that your data won't. You might have to do some manual work with your data to keep it as the next each release comes out. And I mean, I think it's definitely the time to start porting contrib modules, and certainly a lot of the APIs are informed by discovery during porting of modules. And I mean, it's also time to take it for a spin, and if you find any issues, report them, because the more eyes, the better.
And so, that's it.
I think we're done. We've gone long, but we got there.
Yeah, so these are details. Feel free to contact us.
Yes, so thank you. That was so much. I think I can probably happily fit that into several episodes. I don't see any questions on the Q&A app, and now I'm just checking the event page. So either everyone is completely terrified and overwhelmed, or or you covered enough for them to be happy. So so time for your shameless pitch for PreviousNext or whatever cool that you're doing.
Yeah, so PreviousNext, we're sending a few of us over there to the US for DrupalCon Austin. I think we mentioned before we've got Rob Karakas doing a talk on Drupal 8 integrating with AngularJS, and we'll be around. So yeah, if people are in Austin, please come up and say hello.
Yeah, and my pet project at the moment in my spare time is trying to rewrite the whole web test base on top of Mink, which is a PHP DOM library, and I've got about 2,000 files left, and a lot of them are simple. So if someone wants to help me, I'd be more than willing to help.
Okay. Have you got a link for that?
If you just get in touch on IRC or by Twitter or whatever, and I'll send the link. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jared.
Looking forward to seeing you in Austin, and yeah, I have got in Jam's Drupal Camp. I think I have got 2 or 3 more sessions left this week. Let's see. what my calendar says.
Yeah, tomorrow is for the love of content headers, also from one of our...
Right, so whatever time zone you're in, about 23 and a half hours from now, Pam Barone is going to do For the Love of Content Editors, which is a really, really great session about building websites from the perspective or with the actual end users in mind, which, you know, we're not always good at remembering. And a few hours after that, tomorrow is 30 Drupal 8 functions you should already know by Frederick Mitchell, which is a pretty cool session that was done at New York's NYC camp. And yeah, Frederick is from Phase 2, if I'm not mistaken. So a couple more sessions coming this week. Lots of action on the Acquia podcast stream in any case. And look forward to seeing you guys soon. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.